Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Tweak, Test, and Repeat. I'm Mr. Umer, and I'll be going over optimizing performance on your PC for your GPU, or graphical processing unit. So if you don't know, a GPU is slightly different than a CPU. A CPU is a central processing unit. That's kind of like the brain of your computer. That's the piece of hardware that does the math. So there's going to be a lot of applications on your computer that will use the CPU to its fullest, and you'll get performance out of it. But another area where you can improve performance, in my mind, that has a greater impact is on the GPU. And one way of finding out what kind of GPU you have is in Windows 10, there's something called Device Manager. And if you don't know how to get there, you can always go to the search bar here and type in Device Manager. And it's going to pull up this screen here. And this is where all your devices are found. So the GPU is found under Display Adapter. So if you toggle this caret here, it's going to open up and show you what GPU you have. So this is what I have currently on my computer. It's a NVIDIA Geforce RTX 3090. So this is a pretty top-end graphics card. But you'll notice here, when I double click on this, it's going to give me some more properties. And this is the driver. So the driver is one of the most important things that you can do to optimize the performance of your GPU. It basically has all the latest firmware software that NVIDIA, which is a graphics card manufacturer, puts in there to optimize it for Windows. And not just for Windows, but applications that run in Windows. It could be games. It could be content creation apps. You could be someone that does graphics, uses Photoshop, maybe does some video encoding using Premiere, Handbrake. There's many different types of software out there. So that's one of the first things you'll want to do to optimize the performance is number one, find out what kind of graphics card you have. There's many graphics card vendors out there. The main ones are NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. And there's other ones called AIBs that they basically use those same processors for the GPUs and they just rebrand it. So when you go in, you find the driver, you can see the different versions here. For example, mine was up to date since December, and you can see the date there in the driver version. So that's step one in my mind. And you notice here the way I laid out my desktop here, it's pretty busy. There's a lot of applications in here open, or a lot of setting windows open. But starting from left to right, left being the most basic, to right being the most advanced type of optimizations we can do in Windows. So step one, find out what kind of GPU you have. Once you find that out, go online, do a Google search or whatever search engine you use, and locate the latest version of the driver. Next step is you'll notice that I have another window open here, and this one here is the display options under Windows 10. And if you don't know how to get there, you can go ahead and right click and click on display settings on your desktop, and it's going to launch this window. So I'm going to move this window up in front, and you'll see there's a lot of different options. Some of them, they can have a visual impact when you change the setting. Some of them, they can have a performance impact, how they deal with games or applications. So here you'll notice that with this window open, I have a display resolution here. So that's the amount of pixels that I'm displaying on this monitor that I have. So if I pull this down, depending on your you manufacture, your make of your monitor, you're going to have different resolutions. The lower the resolution here, the lower the quality, because there's lower pixels. Then the higher the setting, the higher the quality in general. So most folks, they'll probably be using an HD type resolution for their desktop, which is 1920 by 1080. Most laptops will fall below that. I've seen some where the laptops that I own, they're running this kind of resolution here, 1366 by 768 or something near that resolution. I have another laptop that's running HD and it's somewhere around here, 1080. The market is kind of leaning around 1080p, which is right now the standard, but a lot of the manufacturers are, of course, they're going to be pushing what they call 2K. Some might not like to call it 2K, but really it's 1440p resolution here. And you'll notice that a lot of manufacturers will also do 4K, which is this resolution here. Actually, I don't have 4K here, but 4K will have this same size here. You'll notice that there's a left and right to this size here. The first size is it's basically the length of the desktop. So 3,840 pixels. And then this is the height, 1,080 pixels. So 4K is probably going to have around 2160p. HD, which is 1080p, is going to have 1080. And 2K is going to have around 1440p. So the monitor I'm running right now, it's kind of an odd one. It has a different ratio, what they call 32:9. It's basically an ultra-wide monitor, but it's basically a 1440p where they stretch it out. So kind of imagine the monitor I have is 49 inches. It's basically like two 27-inch monitors put together at that resolution. So that's the first setting there, is the display resolution. Obviously, if you increase the resolution, you may get higher quality, but then a lot of your elements or graphics on the screen are going to become a lot smaller. You'll notice that a lot of my icons are really small. That's probably why I'm wearing glasses. But if you were to change the resolution to say 1080p, then obviously it's going to get larger. Now there's ways around that. You can use what's called display scaling for the fonts. So if I increase this here to 125%, visually on the screen, it'll be similar to 1080p, but it'll be fit within the same window. A lot of the reason for having a smaller resolution is so you can fit more windows like I have here. When you have a larger or use of the screen with a smaller resolution, when you have apps taking more of the screen up, then it's harder to basically fit everything in here. So that's why I optimize the use by having a smaller resolution. So those are some of the options there. There's obviously a lot more. For example, like multiple displays, you might have more than one. I opted for a single display. So now let's get to the performance part of the GPU settings here. So the first one here is we have in our Windows 10 is advanced display settings. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And you'll see my resolution. You'll notice that you'll have something called the refresh rate. So that's how fast the images and the graphics refresh on the screen over time. So for my monitor, it's refreshing at 240 Hertz, the frequency. Most monitors you'll see, or standard monitors that are HD, you'll see them running around 60 Hertz. If you get a good gaming monitor, it might go higher. You might see some that are going 75, 100, 120, 144 becoming a new standard, 165, 185, 200, 240, and even some of the newer ones go up into 300 and beyond, which is just insane. So that's the refresh rate. Refresh rate, if you have the ability to change it in there and you have the setting, which is this drop down here. I don't have anything else here, but I'll show you another area where you can change that. But typically when you click on this setting on your computer, you'll have a lot more modes, some that I mentioned in there. Most will say that, the human eye, what we can see is probably around 60 hertz, which is comfortable. But when you start getting into gaming and high performance type applications, even in video encoding, you'll have some content creators or gamers that they might have a keen eye. They want to have graphics that refresh faster on the screen. Faster graphics in games, most often it leads to better response time. So that's the refresh rate. So one thing that has to do with the color palette or color gamut is the bit depth. So typical screens, you're probably going to see 8-bit as a standard. There might be some that are lower. As it goes up, you'll see 10-bit and 12-bit color. So it's going to depend on your monitor. Also the graphics card too, that has to be able to support that. But basically what that boils down to is on a regular, what we call SDR screen, standard display resolution, you're most likely going to be at 8-bit. So that's going to have a certain amount of colors in that range from 0 to whatever. And normally to the regular person, that will probably be enough. But when you start getting into gaming and content creation, using a lot of Photoshop, video processing, you're going to want to have a higher bit depth because then you start seeing more of the tones of color come out. And you can see that in the photos or the applications that you're using. So that's where we start getting into what's called high dynamic range HDR. So that's going to vary. You might see something that says HDR and then 600, or HDR and then 1000, or HDR and let's say 400. I don't know if that exists. But that second part, the number 400, 600, 1000, that's the brightness, and that's measured in what's called nits. So obviously the higher the number, the higher the brightness. Now on this screen I had to do a little bit of color tweaking to bring the HDR to get more of that depth and to tweak it. Some TVs they can do that automatically. For example, I have a Samsung TV and that does pretty good at doing an auto brightness. But on my monitor with the model that I have, which is a Samsung Odyssey G9, when I enabled the HDR slider, which I'll show you later on, typically what you'll see in Windows 10 is it's pretty washed out compared to SDR. So some folks will look at that and say, well, that looks washed out. I'm just going to disable HDR. Or I'm doing some video capturing and when I enable HDR, sometimes it doesn't have the correct colors in my video. So that's going to come down to your graphics card whether it can support this. Obviously, when everything works and it's in harmony, 10-bit and HDR looks really great. And once you see this video uploaded in YouTube, you'll see the difference in there. You also notice that on YouTube, it allows you to pick the resolution as well as ones that are in HDR. So that's a little bit about the visual type aspects of the performance. So if I hit back here, you notice that I mentioned something about an HDR slider. So if your monitor and your graphics card support it, you can slide that on. Obviously, if it's grayed out, then you probably have an SDR or maybe there's something like a driver you need to install. So that was the advanced display settings. Now if I go even further, there's one called the graphics settings. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the graphics settings. And this is something that normally comes with high performance GPUs. It's called hardware accelerated GPU scheduling. So basically, the way that a GPU works is it's similar to a CPU. CPU is going to have something what's called a thread, and basically a CPU will do is it's going to have lots and lots of threads. Let's say that's from an application or several applications, and it's going to want to go in and try to execute some of those threads simultaneously. Maybe it's only one at a time. Basically, the CPU is going to decide that. Well, the GPU can do that as well, um, but in particular, it can do the scheduling with the memory, so it can move things in and out of the GPU memory. So that's going to depend on how much memory you have on your computer. This performance feature helps a lot when you don't have a lot of memory on your computer. And if you don't know what the memory is, you'll see when you purchase a graphics card, or if you look at the specs on a graphics card, it might say something called VRAM. So on that VRAM, it comes in different sizes. It might have 1 gig, 2 gig, 3 gig, 4 gig, 5 gig, 6 gig, 8 gig, 10 gig, 12 gig. Or if it's a graphics card like mine, it has 24 gig. Or if you look at the AMD cards, the newest ones, the Radeon 6800, 6900 XT, they come with 16 gig. This graphics card that I have from NVIDIA, the RTX 3090, comes at 24 gig, so it has plenty of memory to move applications in there. But I also have some other lower tiered cards like the GTX 1650 Super and the TI. And the models that I purchased come with 4 gigs. So when you have a lower amount of RAM, it's actually good to enable this setting. Sometimes folks will disable in gaming. It might cause issues with the game, but so far I haven't had any issues, so I've turned that on, GPU scheduling. One other area you'll notice here for graphics performance is you can actually have the GPU accelerate certain applications. So normally on its own, the GPU in Windows 10 will try to utilize it to its fullest. And you can see that option here. If you right click on the taskbar, Task Manager, there's some performance options there as well. And you'll see that mine has the GPU listed here. If I move it over there at the bottom here, you can see that 25% of it is being utilized. So right now I'm doing a recording, which is basically capturing my desktop and my video and my audio. And basically you can see the memory on there, 24 gigs being used in there. So when you're capturing, you're doing a lot of video encoding. Some of this 3D might be from some of the application I'm showing on the screen, but you'll notice that using that GPU scheduling, you can see that the memory of what's being used right now, 2 gigs of memory currently of my 24 gigs is being utilized, and you can kind of see the breakdown there. You can see whether the GPU's doing 3D, that's usually gaming, or different applications that do 3D software. Maybe it's like 3ds Max, could be AutoCAD. You can see when the GPU is copying and doing video encoding, which is a function of graphics for video, like MP4 is a file type where you have to encode it in that format so you can stream it online, such as YouTube. Decoding could be when you're playing a movie, like a Blu-ray or an MP4. So this is some other advanced options you can see for your graphics card here. But getting back to this performance option here, where you can actually take an application and use the GPU to accelerate. And this normally happens when it's what's called a classic app. Microsoft Excel is not a classic app, so this comes with a Office 365, but I noticed that it wasn't being accelerated. So, well, how would you know it's being accelerated? If you come back here, you notice that some of these applications will tell you the percentage of being used. I noticed that Excel wasn't showing up here. Another option I have here that comes with the driver software is a a GPU monitor. So I noticed that when I run Excel, it wasn't being shown here. But when I add it as a classic app under this graphics preference, basically you click browse and you locate the Excel. It had some various options here. Let Windows decide. Well, Windows was designed to use the CPU, which is okay. I have an 8-core, 16-thread i9 9900K, which that's more than enough to accelerate the application. When I'm using Excel, if I'm working with a lot of large databases, that may be enough. And that may be enough even on a laptop with a dual core or 4-core. Obviously, the more cores and threads you have in there, and the more optimization, the faster the Excel will run. But you can also accelerate the application by using the graphics card. So they have two options for mine, well, three here, but two for the GPU: power saving and high performance. I normally put it on power saving. Once that's installed here, you'll notice that it'll show as a line here. Another application I found is Pluto TV, which is a free television streaming app. It wasn't showing up in here. Once I added it, it was showing it, and then I can better make use of my GPU rather than my CPU to accelerate the performance in there. Typically, the graphics card is going to do a better job at doing things like decoding in video, which is streaming video, 4K video, or 1080p video, or 1440p video. So it's my preference to use the graphics card to accelerate those types of workloads. So if I go ahead and hit back there, there's not much more to it there. So I'm going to go ahead and close this app here. We went over this here that kind of shows you what processing are using your GPU and the performance related to that. I'm going to close that off. I'm also going to close off this here. So now that brings us to the more medium type settings that you're probably going to want to optimize. Now, one thing that NVIDIA has done is when you download the driver, there's two types here. You notice if I click these menus, some options pop up here. But the one that I want to show you under drivers here, and this little drop down here, you notice that they have one for game ready and they have one for studio. Game ready being one drivers and setting optimized for game performance, so getting the fast frames per second out of games. The next one's studio driver. So this is more giving the more stable drivers to folks that do Adobe, do different types of GPU accelerated applications. So you can also click that there. And the driver typically comes with both, so you could switch between the two. So there's that. And by the way, this is the NVIDIA Geforce experience. It's a separate application that comes with the driver. You'll notice that you can access it here on your taskbar icons. And then you have the control panel, which I have here in white, and then the one that's in black here is the Geforce experience. So Geforce experience normally will, if you hit the home button, it's going to show you your games that are optimized. So I have some games that I have optimized in here. So if I take one, for example, let's take Cyberpunk 2077. I click on the details. You notice that I set my own custom settings depending on my preference of quality and how fast of the frames per second I want. But based on the graphics card from NVIDIA, they have an optimization where if you click optimize, it's going to basically go through your settings and try to give you the best experience. So you notice that there's different ones here. It's suggesting that for screen space reflections, I turn on Psycho. So that's going to give a little bit more. And if you highlight each one of them, it'll tell you, well, this feature, texture quality increases the resolution of textures used on surfaces and objects. So there's going to be various options in there. You notice that we see the resolution of the game in there, which my native resolution is being run in this game. So that's that. So under the home, you're going to see a lot of options that deal with the games and the settings where you could tweak them and optimize for performance. One of the other areas of this panel I want to go in depth on is under settings, which if you click on the gear icon, it gives you a lot more information. For example, you see my rig here. It will tell me if my rig is optimized for doing these types of tasks that a lot of users use uh, with their computers with here. Like, are my games optimized? Can I stream like on OBS or uh, NVIDIA GeForce Experience? Um, can I go in and do virtuality? So this will tell you whether your video card or GPU is cut out for that task. One thing I want to get into though is the settings portion there. So I click on settings. You'll notice that there's a lot more settings that come with my GeForce Experience. If I go ahead and hit done here, you notice that it brings me to another main screen, and I'll go back to the other screen later on. And a lot of these I'll get into later because it has to do with how you set up your stream for your games. But I want to go to the one that's called the Performance tab. So I'm going to click on that, and you notice that I can't move this section on the left, but it does give me some performance settings or specifications for my card. You can see what frequency my card's running at, 1695 megahertz. You can see the temperature. Obviously, if the temperature goes too high, it can reduce the performance because a lot of times the manufacturers, but mainly NVIDIA and AMD, what they do is they try to give you the most performance out of the box. Mainly, they're going to give you the most megahertz or clock frequency, and basically a clock frequency is the amount of time given so that an application can run in there. Obviously, the lower the megahertz, the more time it will take for the application to run. The higher the megahertz, the quicker the application or the more snappier the application will run. So they'll use what's called voltage and current and megahertz tweaking. You might hear them say downclocking or optimization or performance tuning. So basically what they're doing is they're trying to optimize your GPU based on the conditions you're throwing at it. So if it's high performance gaming, that's going to require a lot of GPU horsepower, a lot of memory, a lot of clocks, because there's a lot of elements on the screen. They're 3D. There's a lot of colors that you're throwing at the GPU, and your GPU is going to try to adjust it to stay within your power constraints, your heat constraints. Obviously, on a desktop PC, it's going to be dependent on how much your power supply you have, and then temperature has to do with the threshold which the GPU can operate. So typically, for example, on mine, if I start hitting 90 degrees Celsius, that's when my GPU will start what's called throttling. That's another term they use. Throttle as in they're lowering the clocks so that they can achieve a better thermal performance so you don't melt your card basically. So if you look at that, the performance is shown here. There's another option setting here which is a lot more advanced. You can actually tweak your graphics card to have more clocks, and that's called overclocking. So you can do it on the CPU. You can also do it on the GPU. And a lot of times, manufacturers will tell you, well, your GPU that we manufacture for you has a little bit of headroom, and sometimes they'll tell you that it has headroom, but a lot of times they'll produce graphics cards or CPUs that what's called on silicone wafer, and it's going to perform a certain way, and they'll take the best batches, and they'll say, well, this one here, we'll have them run at this clock because there's a better batch. It's more stable. It runs at those clock frequencies and has a more stable and then we'll tell the users that they can overclock it and they have performance in there. So that's typically because there's there's a better batch that's given in there, and sometimes they'll have a piece of the silicon wafer that's not as good, so they may disable certain performance features on those graphics cards and sell them at a lower price. So if you do have that performance headroom here, you notice that you can tweak the voltage, the power. You notice my slider is 100% voltage. So that means my card normally it swings between zero point 0.8 volts and 1 volt or 1.1 volts. So the more voltage in there, more stable your graphics card will be because you're giving it uh, more voltage, which it can then uh, improve the performance of the card. Um, if you also look that I have my power at 114%, so it's running it a little bit more, and that voltage and that power headroom will allow me to give more clocks. Obviously, you can run it at a lower voltage and power. That's called undervolting. So a lot of folks like to see if they can try to get the most performance and clocks with the lowest amount of powers and voltage put in. Normally on mine, I like to max it out because this is on a desktop computer. If the thermal constraints were more like on a laptop, I can see, well, there's a smaller thermal envelope and uh, you can't really go over a certain amount of wattage. But on mine, I have a good enough power supply that can handle that. The last option the last two options you'll see is the temperature target. Obviously, on by default, it's not 90, but a lot of these newer cards come with a lot of heat sinks and fans that help with the thermal performance. Obviously, if you have the card do it, it'll be on automatic for the fan speed. I have mine on manual, but I'm using another piece of software that basically controls the fan curve, and I'll get more into that later. But normally, a stock card will probably tell you, well, it can run up to around 80 or 88 degrees Celsius. So that's going to be quite a lot of thermal headroom in there. And then obviously there's the GPU's ability to throttle it down to bring it back within those thermal constraints. So it's a lot more you can do here. You can overclock and you can see the result. So I'm going to go ahead and close that off. So that's the performance setting here. If I go back, there were some other options here. This mainly has to do with uh, recording your live streams or your games in there. And typically, the one that I go through to set up for recording uh, basically is the audio, the video capture, and I'll probably do another video on that later if you guys have questions on that. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. One other option you don't see here, um, and it's shown on the video HUD. Basically, the HUD is, the position on your screen here. I'm going to go ahead and do the shortcut key for this one. It's Alt R. It's kind of hard to see here. If I move this out of the way, you'll see that some of the other performance options here are shown in this overlay. And what's great about the overlay is you can show this overlay when you're playing a game. So you can basically see how many frames per second you're getting in your game based on your hardware. You can see how much your CPU and GPU is being loaded, and basically the megahertz and the fan speed and the thermal constraints they're all in play. So this is a good way of seeing your performance metrics as you play, and we'll get that into that more as I do more gaming videos. You'll notice that I'll have this on the screen so you can kind of see like, well, that game is playing and you're getting 100 frames per second, or you're getting 160 frames per second, or you're getting 60 frames per second. And there's a lot more detail to that, so we can get to that later. So I'm going to close that off. There's a lot more options in here. Obviously, we talked about updating your driver. A lot of manufacturers have a tab for drivers, so I can go ahead and check for updates here, and it'll tell me I have the latest driver. Or you can go online, you can search directly on the vendor, and you can get the graphics driver to improve performance. So that's it for that GeForce experience. There's more, but I'll probably get more into depth later on the settings. Another important feature that came with the classic NVIDIA drivers, again, this is where you find it here, is the NVIDIA control panel. So this is what we had before we had GeForce Experience. GeForce Experience kind of makes it flashy and nice and easier to use, shows your video games, but this kind of gets down into the nitty-gritty of the settings. You'll notice that there's various menus here that where you can optimize the visual versus the quality. So right now on mine, I have mine on all the way on quality, or it might be on auto right now. You notice that NVIDIA puts a little graphic here that lets you see the smoothness, or if you're doing something called anti-aliasing, which removes the jaggedness around these 3D objects, but then it may introduce blur. Well, you can optimize that performance, and you can also do that in the GeForce Experience, where it can do the settings for you as well. So normally I skip over that one there. One that I do tweak here is called 3D settings. So when you're using things like anti-aliasing, it might start blurring, when you're trying to eliminate those jagged edges. So NVIDIA has what's called image sharpening, and AMD has its own kind of sharpening tool as well. But for NVIDIA, you can double click on this. I normally try to max out the sharpening or get it close to sharp. Sometimes when you over sharpen it, it might look too grainy on the screen, or it might look odd. So that's one way you can do it. You can sharpen normal graphics, or a lot of games use film grain to make it look like it's classic type. You could also add some sharpness to that as well. Or you can turn it off, and you can try to not or negate the need for sharpening by increasing resolution. So I normally run at 1440p, so there's going to be some jaggedness in there, even though I have a pretty high resolution. But once you run 4K, then depending on your monitor, you may not see those jagged edges in there. A lot of folks, like myself, we use some of the artificial intelligence that come with the card. NVIDIA has AI tensor cores, and so that basically when you enable those features in the games, one called DLSS, Deep Learning Super Sampling, it basically goes in there and tries to do an image upscale. Well, when it does an image upscale, you're basically taking a lower res one. So for example, if I'm using DLSS and I have a 1440p monitor, I enable something like performance, or then I'll be upscaling a 1080p image up to 1440p or 4K and above. If I use ultra performance, I might be upscaling a 720p image. Well, that's going to introduce a lot of artifacts or things that need to be sharpened. So that's one way to counteract those effects of trying to get more performance in frames per second so that you're better at the game, or it's more fluid. To counteract that, you can use this sharpening tool here. You notice that a lot of these settings here, you have what's global, and you can do them individually by the program. So this is one of the settings you saw in the GeForce Experience, but this gets down to the individual drop down. So you go in there and you can do the different settings, and I'll probably do a video on that because that can get pretty in depth. But just know there's global and there's program settings. Some of the other ones I go ahead and I leave them by default because a lot of the games they can tweak that as well. Next, you have the resolution here. You notice that I fully tweaked mine here. So later on, or earlier we saw in the display, I wasn't able to change the refresh, but you'll notice that I don't have too many on here, 60, 120, and 240. Some monitors allow you to tweak an entire range. If you go back to this setting here under Manage 3D settings, NVIDIA has something called DSR, and for some reason on mine, my firmware, my driver doesn't show it on here, but basically dynamic super sampling or super resolution, DSR. It allows you to basically not upscale, but basically simulate it. So I can, if I had DSR enabled, which I had on my previous 35-inch monitor, it was a 1080p monitor, but I could simulate 4K. So basically everything got smaller, and the GPU was actually rendering at that. So you would get better quality but lower performance. On mine, I can't actually enable it, but if you go back to the resolution, when you have DSR, then it's going to show in your different resolutions. On mine, it looks pretty limited, but I do have the two main ones that are the widescreen here, the HD and the I guess that would be Quad HD. Remember we talked about the color depth there, helping you have more pixel depth for your HDR. So there's some settings here. Usually 30-bit is the best. RGB here, full range, 10-bit color. So try to enable those. If you want to learn more, you can always do a Google search. Some of the other settings here have to do with the digital vibrance. I think I tweaked mine up here to 65%. So you can play with the sliders and get different colors. And I believe it does it dynamically so you can see it on the screen. Other settings here, rotating the screen, HDCP or HDCP, high bandwidth digital content protection. So that normally helps with I believe it's the encryption of the video you're streaming on here. I'll probably have to do a little more research and do a video for that. On here on mine it's disabled, most likely because of the refresh rate. I believe that the HDCP probably runs 120 or 60 hertz. So on mine 240 it's not enabled. Got the audio coming from my screen. I don't have that because I'm streaming it through speakers or through headphones. I'm going to skip to the most important one, which is called G-Sync. So it might be called FreeSync for AMD. FreeSync and G-Sync work under an NVIDIA GPU. If you have a monitor that has G-Sync, or for example on my S9 here, or G9, sorry. S9 is the Samsung, but well, they're both Samsung, but mine's a Samsung G9. It has what's called G-Sync Ultimate. So there's certain specifications that come with that. And I know NVIDIA probably went through and lowered that in there, but currently I believe G-Sync Ultimate has like HDR 1000 and you know, max resolution or max refresh rate under specification. But I know they've lowered it because I've seen a lot of monitors pop up where they have like HDR 600, or maybe they're not running 240, they have a lower refresh rate. So G-Sync, you're going to want to enable that. A lot of benchmarks will say turn it off. Well, you know, you want to try to get the max. And you can always switch it on and off. But basically what G-Sync does is inside my Odyssey G9, there's a NVIDIA component to it that basically when you run too many frames, it's going to start what's called tearing on the screen. So you might see graphics that are out of place. So G-Sync basically does what it says. It synchronizes that. It's a graphic synchronization. So you can make it look really, really smooth. It also helps with when you're playing a game and let's say it only runs around 30 or 40 frames per second. You know, the most comfortable gaming is 60 frames per second. You know, it's that 60 frames per second and 60 hertz are kind of synonymous. So if you have a monitor that's 60 hertz and the game runs at 60 frames per second, then you're going to see everything as smooth as possible. But if there's elements in the game that drop it down to 30 frames per second, you might see some lag in there. So G-Sync tries to stabilize that to keep it smooth in there. So that's one of the settings you're going to definitely want to enable on here. It's called G-Sync, or it might be called FreeSync in there. And that's pretty much it for this panel here. There's some other tweaks you could do here for the video, the imaging, the color. I do have the video in here. I have some filters that optimize the video performance. So lastly, I'm going to get into, this is the more advanced here, and obviously it can get a lot more advanced compared to what I have here if you become one of those professional overclockers. You might be using like liquid nitrogen, but you'll notice that a lot of those enthusiasts use similar tools here. They're going to have basically a graphics overclocking tool. The card that I have is the NVIDIA RTX 3090. And you can obviously use the GeForce experience, and I showed you where you can tweak the voltage, the fan settings, the power, the clocks, or you can have it automatically do it. It has a slider on that tool, and if you don't remember, it's I believe it's Alt Z performance. It looked like that. Um, but this is a very popular tool. It's called MSI Afterburner. So MSI is another AIB that take NVIDIA and AMD cards and they resell them. They put their brand or logo on it, but they have a pretty good tool here, and I'll probably do another video to go more in depth. But you notice that some of the same options I had in the GeForce Experience you could tweak here: the power limit, the temp limit, the clock rate, um, and if you install the full options in here, I believe MSI has an overlay also similar to what you saw here. And it's going to have a lot more options in there for the overlay. But we'll get into another video on that later. But you'll see the driver and the graphics card I have here. There's different settings that you can go through here. I'm not going to go through. But basically I have mine, you'll notice mine is, stock is normally at a certain megahertz. As you recall, mine was showing 1695 on that other panel, but that's actually, it's going to be a slippery slope. There's different kinds of clocks that you're going to have on a graphics card. There's one that's the GPU clock, and then there's the boost clock, and we're probably going to have to do an overclocking video on that later on. But just to summarize, mine is running plus 90 on the graphics core clock. The memory, I don't have any in there, and we can get more into detail later in there. But you notice that mine is overclocked. I'm using MSI Afterburner. This other tool below MSI Afterburner is called TechPowerUp GPU-Z. If you're familiar with CPU-Z, which shows you the performance and metrics of your CPU, the TechPowerUp GPU-Z basically goes more into depth what's in your card in here. So you can see the different default settings I have for my graphics card, and you can basically see the result after I overclock it to get more performance. There's going to be different options in here as well. This option here is called the render test. Sometimes you won't see the full performance of your GPU. For example, my GPU, the boost clock is running at 1695. Normally it's going to be running at 1395, but I added 90, so that boosted it up to 1485. But basically the range of my video card can scale up between actually below 1395. If you look at the overlay, sometimes when your GPU is idle, it could be running at its lowest clock to try to not use as much watts in there, just to conserve power and to keep the thermal constraints good. But the boost range on mine typically 1395 up to I've seen some where it hits like 2000, say 65 megahertz. So that's a lot of headroom. But you'll notice that the boost is showing 1695. If I get to this rendering test, basically it's going to run a little 3D test. And you'll notice here it boosted actually up to 2070. Remember we talked about GPU throttling. So as this test is running, you notice that it is throttling down. Now it's at 255. And normally when your GPU is running a game or even rendering, it's going to try to find that comfortable range that it's going to be in. So it might go in between 1395 and let's say 2077 megahertz. So it's going to adjust. So that throttling basically helps optimize it in there. And basically you can't melt your card. It's the manufacturer's way of basically putting in some safety measures. So you don't basically melt your card and all your money was wasted. If I shut that off, then you'll notice that the fans did kick up, but then it throttled the clock back down to 1695. So we'll do another video on that to give you more in-depth analysis of what's going on in your GPU. So we'll go ahead and close that off, those two tools there. The last tool I want to go over is hardware monitor. hardware info 64. So that's another tool you can download. It's free. It's not just for the GPU. You know, if I scroll up, I'm going quite fast there, but it's basically tells you, you know, what frequency your CPU is running at, you know, how it's loaded, like the threads. But if I jump down, there is a GPU section here. So I'm going to scroll down. And you notice that some of the uh, options there or settings or specifications that are not shown in the overlay or in the TechPowerUp GPU-Z or even in Windows or the NVIDIA driver is going to show up here. So this is important because you can kind of check how much power consumption your GPU is using. Now, there's a lot of performance calculators that you can download online when you're building a PC. For example, based on your combination of CPU, GPU, because those are used the most power. Obviously, if you use the more efficient uh, processors like from AMD, they have a lot smaller process nodes, so that can lead to more performance and better thermal constraints. Um, but on here, using this hardware monitor, when you overclock the GPU, you can see how much power is being used in there. So I believe on my uh, desktop PC, I'm using a 850 watt uh, power supply. So typically an RTX 3090 stock is probably going to use around 350 watts. NVIDIA does suggest you have at least a 750 watt um, power supply. You could use a lower one, but then obviously that's going to, you know, running full load, it's going to use your power supply even more, even if it's 80 plus gold or whatever. Has a good power factor correction. When you have more wattage headroom, especially for a desktop, um, your GPU and your CPU can use that in there. Obviously, in a laptop, that's more constrained because their thermal envelope is a lot smaller because of the battery. But when you're plugged into the outlet, you have a lot more um, power budget you can work with. And you know, you have a lot of users. Maybe they're trying to be more green. Maybe they're monitoring it, seeing how much wattage you use. Typically, I've seen some when I'm overclocked and running a game like Cyberpunk uh, or Call of Duty or Warzone, Black Ops. I've seen it overclocked hitting around 400 watts on the GPU. Um, and obviously the CPU is going to use some of that budget as well. So basically this is a pretty good software. We'll go more into it in depth later, but you notice that it shows the GPU temperature, the voltages. Uh, you can see the wattages. So definitely I recommend getting this tool along with the other tools I've shown in there. Well, that's all I have for this episode. Please like and subscribe if you like this video. I'll leave some links in the description for some of these tools so you can download them and maybe utilize them. So that's it for this episode. I hope to see you again next time. Bye.